Piper.
Cristo
On Talk Radio, the home of common sense.
Evening, it's Cristo here on Talk Radio Drive. In for Jeremy Kyle, how are you? Thanks so much for your company tonight. So much that's been on the menu. Zelensky is saying that the West is lacking humanity. Is that kind of language helpful? Hey, did you see the story earlier that now Tchaikovsky's not going to be played? Because, you know, that'll show Putin, won't it? And also lots and lots of other stories around this that we can explore with my political panel. Let's now cross live to them this evening. On the left, Asad Rehman, who is a civil liberties campaigner. On the right, Alys Watson Brown, political commentator at Young Voices UK. Evening to you both.
Evening.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to us here on Talk Radio. Zelensky has accused the world, as I just said, of losing humanity. It says that the world has the power to stop Russian airstrikes. He says that now some have hit a hospital. There are children under the wreckage. We heard one of his advisors saying what else needs to happen for the West to realise this is a conflict that they will have to be engaged in more directly. What do you think about that? Alys, I'll start with you. Are we lacking in humanity, and do we need to start getting involved when it comes to this no-fly zone?
I wouldn't say we're lacking in humanity. I mean, the West certainly has the power to pursue direct military action against Putin, but do we have the power to deal with the after effects? It's a bit of a contrast to Zelensky's, very heart-wrenching address to the UK Parliament earlier, and he thanked us. I mean, the UK has raised £120 million for Ukraine in just 5 days, but we do have to remember that a no-fly zone over Russia means war. And that brings in other global actors such as China. And do we have the capacity to deal with them? Do we have any idea how that would turn out? You cannot deny the awfulness of what is going on and the suffering that has occurred to the Ukrainian people. But we are in sort of a catch-22 situation.
All right, Asad, what's happening in Ukraine is terrible, heart-wrenching, awful, brutal, but what could happen if we intervene could be far worse.
So absolutely, look, I think we can all see what's happening in Ukraine, and listening to President Zelensky's moving speech, it was compelling. Who can listen to a leader talk about the destruction of their country, the attacks on civilians? And there were lots of fighting talk in that speech. It was very Churchillian in tone, and trying to evoke the spirit of the Blitz, and of course he was very conscious of his audience. But I think there are 2 points, and I agree. I think we have to be very, very conscious and very, very careful about the idea that somehow no-fly zones will not spiral out into a greater conflict. There are many other tools available for the international community, and we can say quite rightly that maybe what's happened now is because the international community has not responded to military aggression in the way that it should have done. If you look at what's happened in Yemen and the bombing of Yemen, what's happened in Palestine, in many, many other places, the idea of international law has been weakened over these last few years, and are we now paying the price of that? How do we step up to that? So, of course, President Zelensky could have made a slightly different speech, right? He could have said, how is it that the UK has become the hub for Russian oligarchs to launder their money, which has enabled Putin to stay in power and have the support that he's done? I saw, Cristo, your clip just before the news clip, talking about refugee protection. Of course, we know there are 750,000 Ukrainian refugees in Poland. We haven't really done enough. I think most people recognise we've not done enough as a government. I think as people, absolutely, the outpouring of humanitarian solidarity in raising money for the Ukrainian people has been incredible, and it just shows the idea that people don't care about other people. Absolutely, we do care.
But respectfully, Asad, aren't you being just a little naive in thinking that Zelensky is going to address the UK Parliament? He wants a favour from them in as much as a no-fly zone. He wants weaponry desperately, which we've just supplied a load of UK anti-tank missiles, is he really going to sit there and say, but, you know, this is your fault that Putin's got the money to do this, you know, you have facilitated all of this Russian money going through the UK? I mean, he's not going to use his parliamentary address to a country he wants help from to do that, is he?
No, of course he isn't. But I'm saying that, you know, when we talk about, you know, what quite rightly people are saying, we want to do more. And I think too many people glibly say, oh, well, we should be involved in a military conflict with Russia, not actually understanding where that and the consequences of that. So there are other tools in the toolbox that the government should be looking at. And we should be saying, actually, we can do these things. So I would say those are important, because what we don't want is another shooting war. We don't want NATO intervention. We don't want a war spiraling out of control. And we don't want the possibility of course, of a nuclear war. So all of these things are really, really important, and we have to put them into context. So, of course, Zelensky's asking for a favor, but we have to be realistic and measured in how we respond and make sure that the responses are the right responses.
All right, talking of the right responses, Alys, I'll come back to you. The Cardiff Philharmonic Orchestra has just announced that it's taken Tchaikovsky off its list of symphonies that it'll be playing because, obviously, Russian connections. I mean, look, I get sanctions, I really do, but does Putin honestly think that a Tchaikovsky piece of music is in some way an endorsement of Russia and the war? I mean, isn't this getting to be a little virtue signally now, or is this a good thing?
I agree. I think it's kind of pointless. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't appreciate the rich Russian culture and history. I mean, do we cancel Shostakovich, who was, you know, an incredible artist, who, you know, his life was spent trying to please Stalin to avoid him being excommunicated? I think it's wrong. And, you know, for Tchaikovsky, it's one of my favorite. You know, I love ballet and I love all the music that he wrote. I think it's virtue signaling. It's pointless, and it's sour. It sours any part of, you know, any reason why. You've got to put your feet in the place of Russian citizens here. They're allowed to love their country without loving their leader. And that doesn't mean that we do them the disservice of abandoning certain aspects of their culture that they can be proud of.
Okay, I mean, but does it give the wrong message, Asad? Does it show that perhaps, I don't know, are they worried, the Cardiff Philharmonic Orchestra, that perhaps they're coming across as pro-Russia by playing some Tchaikovsky?
I think people...
No, let me put that to Asad, Alys, and then I'll let you respond.
And it just shows how we've spiraled in our political debate, right? That's what people think they must do to somehow show solidarity, as if, you know, taking action against all things Russian. I mean, there's a story today about people boycotting Russian restaurants in New York of second-generation Russians. There are people... This is ridiculous, and it actually plays into Putin's hands, because it allows him to talk about this as an attack on Russia and Russians, not an attack on his regime, on his misguided policies, on his military intervention. So absolutely, it's a silly move. But we shouldn't be...
Where does that end, though? Because the problem that we have with sanctions, and I fundamentally agree that that's pretty much all we've got. Other than arming Ukrainians, that's all we've got. But all sanctions could potentially, Asad, play into that narrative, couldn't they? Because, you know, if Putin is putting out the message to Russian people that, look, I'm liberating Ukraine, the West think we're evil for doing this, when really it's an act of liberation, and look, the West is Russiaphobic, that's why you can't use your bank accounts. That's why you Russian people are going to suffer. It's the West. And there is a real danger, and if the opinion polls about the war are to be believed in Russia, there is a real danger that we are going to play into Putin's hands, and that more and more people in Russia are going to become anti-West.
Absolutely. So the importance is to have targeted economic and political sanctions. That's why I mentioned the oligarchs, right? That if you want to actually hit Putin, you have to hit his apparatus, the people who he supports, the people who finance, the money that's coming in to support the war effort. You can absolutely have targeted economic sanctions. That is very, very different from people just saying randomly boycott all things Russian. It's It's gesture politics of the worst kind. It's meaningless, and it actually plays into Putin's hands. And people should be able to separate Russia and the Russian people from Putin. The idea that the very people, and many of these artists who were stood up against dictatorships, who stood up for human rights, are now being cancelled in the name of standing up for human rights.
But there will also, but on the flip side, there will also be people in Russia that do support Putin, and there will be people saying, well, actually, hang on, if Russian people don't suffer somewhat at the hands of their regime, how are those people ever going to stand up against that regime? I mean, Alys, do you appreciate the balance here?
Yes, I mean, there's obviously nuance, and there are obviously going to be people of Russia who support Putin. And if you think that we are going to assume that these people are somewhat culturally backward because of their views, that's completely their right. They may advocate for something that violates international law over territorial integrity and, is, in my view, misinformed. But we can't, as you said, you can't just assume that this is just completely one-dimensional.
Is there also a danger of us straying into what some people are calling a bit Russiaphobia as well, in as much as, if there is some sort of, I don't know, terrible act carried out, let's say an act of Islamic extremism, for instance, we are very careful, rightly, to say, look, we can't tar everyone with the same brush. We can't tar everyone with an Islamic belief with the brush that represents them, because that is wrong to do that. But there does seem to be more of an appetite when it comes to Russia, and some people are actually almost calling it anti-white racism in a way, because if you are, many people are making the point, whether it's right or wrong, that because Russians aren't of a different ethnicity, that people can kind of get away with it. There seems to be this appetite to say, well, look, all Russians are to blame, when perhaps if they were of another ethnicity or another ideology, that wouldn't be the case. What's your comment on that? Alys, I'll start with you.
I haven't seen much of a narrative blaming the Russian people as a whole. But I do understand
but taking away Netflix, taking away McDonald's, taking away their ability to use their banking infrastructure, not being able to get their food delivered to them, all of that stuff is harming Russian people.
I think I agree. We do have to take that threat into account, but I think you're merging certain concepts here about, firstly, government sanctions, about banning the sort of SWIFT transaction, about banks, and about the ruble. But I think the symbolic departure of McDonald's and corporations drawing their own virtue signaling line, I don't necessarily agree with that, because where do you draw that line? Do we expect them to stop trading in countries such as Saudi Arabia or China, who also have awful human rights? But if
I guess the point I'm making, and Asad, I'd love your comment on this, but if we were to say if there had been a terrible Islamic terror attack based on an Islamic ideology that doesn't represent all people of the Islamic faith, right? If there was a thought, if there was a movement to say, right, we should pull all banking and money and etc. out of Islamic countries, there would be uproar about that.
I agree, there would be.
Asad, what do you say?
Cristo, I think we just, again, they say a day in politics is like a long time in politics, right? But, remember pre the Gulf War, we imposed sanctions on the Iraqi people, and close to 1 million Iraqi children died as a result. Now, does it create more support for the regime, or do people go, thank God we're being sanctioned as people and our children are dying because everybody's against Saddam? I think there's a difference between government sanctions aimed at governments and sanctions that hit people. And I think we have to avoid sanctions that hit people, because look at Russia. Look at the incredible amount of people coming out on the streets against the war, really bravely coming out. We need to be supporting those voices and those movements.
But those voices are being just completely dwarfed, though, by if the statistics are to be believed, those people who are in favour of the war, which I think has now risen to 71%. So it's a real fine line, and I'm just trying to explore whether there's a double standard, really.
No, of course. Look, there is a fine line. Tony Benn made a speech once in Parliament, which just really struck with me. And he was talking about his own experiences during the Blitz, right, of seeking shelter, and then saying, and drawing analogies, saying, like, when we drop bombs on people in other countries, do they not feel the same anger? Do they not feel the same kind of spirit? Do they not say, have the same human responses? Now, so we have to be very, very conscious. We know that authoritarian leaders use war and conflict as a way of rallying their own nations behind them. We know that happens, and it has happened in the West as much as it does anywhere else. But we know also that can be quite fragile and can begin to unravel. And what regimes look for is moments that allow them to solidify that. And the way to solidify that is to hit individual Russians. The way to unravel it is to hit the Putin regime and the Putin administration.
But I'm not sure there is a distinction between the two, because you could say harming government ultimately ends up harming the people when that gets passed down. Listen, we've got to leave it there, but good to talk to you both. Asad Rehman, civil liberties campaigner, Alys Watson Brown, political commentator at Young Voices UK. When we